Hello and welcome back to Animated Banners with CSS. Now that we've got our initial heading 1 animation complete, we're going to move on to our longer looping animation. And this is a more complicated animation, so we're just going to jump right into it. And we're going to start at the left. So at the 0% mark, our heading 1 text is going to be, if you remember, let's jump back into our browser and refresh. It initially animates on, and then at the 0% mark for this next animation, our heading text is at a left value of 400 pixels. So that's where it's going to start. Let's jump back into our code, or into our chart, excuse me. So again, at the 0% mark, our left position is going to be 400 pixels. That 400 pixels is going to remain in place over the next 5 seconds, because remember, this is a delay. So at 42%, once that 5 seconds is over, at 42%, our left value is still going to be 400 pixels because nothing has happened yet. But then over the next 4% of our animation, that text is going to animate off and it will finish at 46%. Then we have another delay. We have a delay of 4% here plus the extra 5 seconds that occurs over here while the reader is reading the second set of text that has come onto the banner. So we have these two delays added together, which equals 46%. So we're going from 46% here to a value of 92%. And at 92%, we're going to have the same left position that we had at 46%, because remember, this is just a delay. Then from 92 to 96%, we're going to animate it back on, and then we're going to have another half-second delay until we get to the 100% mark, excuse me. So let's walk through that. We're going to jump back into our code, and we're going to try to get this done fairly quickly. We've created our initial keyframe for the first animation for the heading. So now I'm just going to take all of that and nudge it down, and let's actually comment some of these sections out so that they're easier to find. So I'm going to create a line of comment here, and we're just going to label this part Snowfall. I just want to make these files a little bit easier to read because they're going to be cluttered with lots of animations. So we've done that, and let's label this section headings. So this will include heading 1 and heading 2. So we've got the initial heading 1 animation done. Now let's nudge that down a little bit, and let's create the looping heading 1 animation. So the default keyframes rule would look like this, at keyframes, and then the name of it, let's just call it heading 01-loop. So this is going to contain all of those keyframes that we just discussed while we were looking at the chart. So we're going to start with 0%. And at the 0% mark, we are in the same spot that we were at the end of our initial animation when it came onto the stage, or when it animated onto the banner, and it ended up at a left position of 400 pixels. So that's where we're going to start whenever we start our next loop. So we're going to start this at a left position of 400 pixels. And again, that's at the 0% mark. So let's go back to our chart. And on our chart, right here, we're dealing with heading 1 now. We start at a value of 400 pixels, and remember, we have a 5-second delay now before anything else happens. So once we get to the 42% mark, we're still at that same value. So we're going to come back to our keyframes rule, and we're going to create a 42% keyframe. And at 42%, our left value is still going to be 400 pixels, because from that span, from 0 to 42%, we're not moving, we're delaying, we're letting the user read all of the text that's on the stage. And then from 42% to the next keyframe, we'll be animating that text back off. So let's go back over here and take a look at that. So again, for the next 4%, we're going to be animating heading 1 back off of the stage. And as we can see here, that animation is going to end at 46%. So 46 is going to be our next keyframe. So we'll jump back to our code, and we'll create a rule for 46%, or a keyframe at 46%. Now here we're going to animate it off the stage, but I don't want it to animate back to the left where it started. Instead, I want it to continue animating off to the right. Now, if you remember, our stage is 900 pixels, or our banner, excuse me, is 900 pixels wide. So I want to push this to a left position of maybe 920 pixels, just to make sure it gets all the way off the right edge of the banner. So again, at 46%, it has moved off the right edge, and that occurs right here. Then we have another delay that spans this 4% as well as this extra 42% here. So we have a delay that runs from 46% all the way to 92% before that animates back on again. So we'll create another keyframe at 92%, and that keyframe, again, it's at the end of a delay, so it's going to have the same left value that we had at the beginning of the delay. So again, at 92%, we'll create a new keyframe here, and here the left position is going to be exactly the same, 920 pixels. So we'll jump back to our chart, and then from 92 to 96, we're going to animate it back on, and this is where it gets a little tricky, because I want to animate it on from the left side of the stage. This animation will always come in from the left side. However, our text is now to the right of the stage. So what we need to do is we need to throw it back to the left edge of the stage before we animate it back on. So let's experiment real quick. Instead of 92%, let's put the end of this particular delay at 91%, and then at 92%, we're going to start our next animation. So at 92%, our left position is going to be back at a value of negative 500 pixels. And then again, that animation is going to end at a value of 96%. So at 96%, we will have animated it back on. So at 96%, we're going to set the left value once again to 400 pixels. So in a moment, when we run this animation, we'll see if that works, and we'll discover a slight problem with it. But let's go ahead and finish this out. So we end our animation at 96%, and then it's just going to sit there for the other 4%. So we'll create another keyframe at 100%, where we'll set the left value to 400, which is the same as the value here, because again, this is another delay where it's just sitting there waiting for something else to happen. So there's our animation. In order to test it, we need to make it a WebKit animation. So we'll change this to @-WebKit-keyframes. So let's save that, and we called it heading 01 loop. So I'll just highlight the name of that and copy it, and that'll make it easier when we get into our other CSS file. So we'll go to banner.css, we'll find text heading 01, and we'll create our animation. Now we have a little bit of a problem in that we've already assigned something to this animation property. And we can't have two different animation properties with two different values because one of them is going to override the other. However, with the animation property, we can assign multiple animations just by using a comma-separated list. So after this one, after the forwards here, I'm going to put a comma, space, and then we'll just enter in the information for our second animation, which again, if we just paste what we copied, is called heading 01-loop. So that's the name of the animation. The next thing we need is how long is that animation going to take? Well, if we remember, by going back to our chart here, it's going to take 12 seconds. We have 5 plus 1 plus 5 plus 1, which adds up to 12 total seconds. So this animation is going to be 12 seconds long, so 12s. And then our easing function that we want to use for each step of this animation, we're just going to use the default ease. And then we can put a delay here if we want to. And we do want to use this delay because right now, remember, we have this first animation that occurs over the course of 1 second before this second animation is supposed to start. So we need a delay of 1 second to allow this first animation to take place. And then once that 1 second has elapsed, this second animation will start. So I'm going to put 1s here. So again, we have the name of the animation, the duration of the animation, the easing function we want to use, and then the amount of delay that we want for that animation. Finally, and this part is important, we want this animation to loop over and over again. We want this entire animation here to loop. So we need to also, after this 1 second delay, add the keyword infinite. That way, this animation here by itself, not this animation over here, but this second animation will loop infinitely. So let's see if that works. Let's save all of our files. We'll jump into Chrome, and refresh our page. And it starts with our first animation, and that worked fine. And then we have a 5-second delay, and hopefully it will animate off, and it does. And we see a small problem there with our text suddenly changing its width and going down to 2 lines, but then it animates back on. But we had a small problem when it animated back on. You'll see it in a second. Watch when it zooms back over to the left. We're actually going to see it over the banner. So we can see that zooming to the left before it comes back on to the right. And it's actually an easy fix, but I wanted you to see it there to see why we needed to fix it. So again, watch it before it animates back on. It zooms to the left and then animates on, and that's not what we want. So let's jump back into our code and let's fix that problem. We'll jump into animations.css. And remember, we had this 5-second-ish delay here where we're going from 46% to 91%. And then from 91% to 92%, we zoomed over to the left to a value of -500 pixels before we animated it back on. And that's the right idea. That's what we need to do. We just need a shorter amount of time for this animation to occur, for it to jump from the right side of the stage all the way to the left side of the stage. So to make that animation even quicker, I'm going to change this 91% to 91.99%. That way, it only has 0.01% of our 12 seconds to get from the right side of the stage to the left side of the stage before it animates back on here. So let's test that. We'll save our file, refresh our browser, we'll watch it animate on, we'll wait 5 seconds, and then it should animate off to the right. And again, we'll see our second problem where it goes down to 2 lines of text, and that's an easy fix as well. But now watch it before it animates back on. It just suddenly appears over to the left and then animates back on. We don't see that flash as it zooms back across the banner, and that's exactly what we need. So that item is fixed. The last thing we need to fix is after it animates off to the right, it breaks into 2 lines because the width is being pushed down. So we basically just need to set the width, and that should take care of the problem. So let's jump back into our code. Let's go to banner.css. And for this text heading 01 rule, all we need to do is set the width. And I'm going to set it at 900 pixels, which is the same width as the banner itself. And we'll just save that, and that should take care of our problem. So we'll refresh it in Chrome. We'll watch it animate on. We'll wait 5 seconds, and hopefully when it animates off, it will stay 1 line of text, and we see that it does. So then you'll just want to watch your animation all the way through, maybe even watch it loop a couple of times, just to make sure that everything still works fine. But that looks pretty good. So now we need to animate our second heading on, and our second heading is going to be very similar to the first one. So let's jump back into animations.css and let's highlight this first heading here. And let's go ahead and create some vendor prefixed versions. We'll paste it 3 times. And for the second one, we'll create a Mozilla version, an Opera version. Oops, I always do that. It's going to be the letter O, not the number 0, and then a plain keyframes version here. So then I'm going to grab the WebKit version, copy it, and then let's nudge all of this down a little bit, and then come up here to the very top and paste that WebKit version, and we're going to create a new animation for heading 02 loop. So all of the numbers are pretty much exactly the same here as far as the percentages go. If we go back to our chart, we can see the heading 2 animation looks identical to the heading 1 animation. The delays are all exactly the same. The only difference is while one's animating off, the other one's animating on. So from 42 to 46%, heading 2 is going to be animating on instead of off. So let's go back to our code and let's make this happen. So first we need to go to banner.html and uncomment this first heading. Let's go ahead and save that and jump back into our browser and refresh. And now we see we have an intruder here. We have this other piece of text that's just hanging out there, and we need to move that off the edge. So we're going to move that to a value of -500 pixels to start off. So we'll go back to banner.css, and for that text heading 2, right now it's at a value of 400 pixels. We're going to change that to -500 pixels. Also, just to avoid that problem we saw with a line break in the first heading, we're also going to go ahead and set the width for this to 900 pixels. Then we'll jump over to animations.css and we'll edit the values here for this animation. So initially at the very beginning, remember this is not the one that's being animated on at the beginning. Heading 01 is being animated on at the very beginning. So at 0%, the left value of this one is still going to be -500. Then after that initial delay here, we're going to animate it on. So from 42 to 46, we're going to animate it back on. Let's go back to our CSS file. So after this delay, it still needs to be at -500. And then from 42 to 46, it's going to animate on to a value of 400 pixels. So that's when this animates on. Then we can go back to our chart and see that we have a delay that lasts until 92%. From 92 to 96%, it will animate off to the right, and then we'll have another delay. Now the cool thing about this one is we don't have to worry about this 91.99% because when this loops back to the beginning, it's going to see that 0% and it's automatically going to set its left position back to -500. It's not going to animate there, it's just going to jump to a position of -500. And that occurs because it's jumping when it loops. It's jumping from 100% all the way back to 0% in a split second. So it just happens immediately. So we don't have to worry about this extra 91.99% here. We can get rid of that one. And so again, we have this delay from 46 to 92%. So at 92%, it needs to be at the same value it was at 46%. And then at 96%, it will animate off to the right edge. So we'll set it to a value of 920 pixels, and then it will be delayed there for half a second. And at the end of that half second, it will still be at 920 pixels. So that should take care of our heading 2 animation. So let's save that, jump over to banner.css and point to that animation. And we can do that very easily by highlighting this animation here, copying it, and then coming down to heading 02 and pasting it. And then we just need to get rid of this initial on animation. And we're just creating the loop. And we need to point to the heading 02 loop here instead of heading 01. But we still have a 12-second animation with a 1-second delay at the beginning. Remember that 5-second delay at the beginning of this heading 2 loop is not going to occur until this initial 1 second passes, until this initial animation up here occurs. So all of our looping animations from here on out need to have that 1 second delay because there's that extra 1 second at the very beginning where the initial items are animating on. So that should take care of this animation. Let's go ahead and save it and see if it worked. We'll jump into our browser and refresh. And we see that Friday and Saturday is now over here to the left. And hopefully when our first heading animates off, our second one will animate on, and it worked just fine. So we'll wait another 5 seconds and see Friday and Saturday animate off while the other one animates back on. So we want to watch it for a second, make sure that it's looping okay. And once we know that it is looping okay, we can move on. And so far it looks really good. It will animate off, the initial one will animate back on, and everything looks good. So that takes care of our heading animations. So let's jump back into our file here and let's make all of the vendor prefixed versions. So we have this one, we'll copy it, paste it 3 times. So we have WebKit, MOZ for Mozilla, the letter O for Opera, and then just animation by itself for the default animation property. So then we'll do that down here as well. Copy it, paste it 3 times, and then we'll have Mozilla, Opera, and then just animation. And so that takes care of that. Let's go ahead and save it and refresh it again just to make sure. We're not going to watch it all the way through again. We just want to make sure the first couple transitions work okay. And it did. We didn't break anything. So with that done, we'll move on to the next video. Thank you for watching.